The Young and the Restless spoilers Wednesday, full October 1st, 2025. The days ahead in Genoa City promised turbulence, as if the ground beneath Newman, Abbott, and every faction tied to them was shifting toward another storm. At the heart of it all, Victor Newman was already moving his pieces on the chessboard. His instincts told him a new threat was coming, and Victor never ignored instinct. He began gathering his troops in the way only Victor could, securing allies, commanding loyalty, and preparing his family for battles they didn't yet know were coming. His children and grandchildren were accustomed to his maneuvers, but even they could feel that this was something heavier, something that required not just corporate strategy but personal resolve. Victor had weathered decades of enemies, betrayals, and upheavals, yet the determination in his eyes made it clear he was ready to wage another war, one that would cut across family lines, business alliances, and every rival daring to stand in his way. Meanwhile, the undercurrent of tension stretched into another battlefield entirely, Abbott Communications. Sally Spectra, fresh from her bruising battles both professional and personal, found herself standing in the eye of a storm she hadn't created yet couldn't escape. For months she had struggled to prove that her ideas, her vision, and her ability to reinvent could hold weight in a city that had long dismissed her as an outsider. Now, with Billy Abbott drifting back into her orbit, she saw both risk and salvation in equal measure. Sally was not naive, she knew exactly how dangerous it was to let Billy back into her plans, given his past volatility and the string of bad decisions that had already wounded his family. But there was something in his voice this time, something more sober, more regretful, that suggested he was serious about redemption. To Sally, that was worth a gamble. To Audra Charles, it was nothing short of a betrayal. When the news reached Audra, she was blindsided. The sharp, confident woman who rarely let emotions cloud her judgment found herself rattled by the realization that Sally had welcomed Billy back. In the hushed glow of Abbott Communications offices, Audra's disbelief rang sharp as glass. She accused Sally of trying to convince herself rather than the team, of using Billy's supposed repentance as a crutch. "Why are you pushing this so hard?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "Are you trying to persuade me, or are you just desperate to persuade yourself?" The words cut deep, because Sally knew Audra had touched the truth. She was trying to convince herself that Billy was changed, that this time he would not implode, that his loyalty could be more than a flickering flame. Sally countered with quiet defiance, insisting that her eyes were wide open. But the fallout was immediate. Plans for the company's relaunch, the highly anticipated party that was supposed to cement their place back in the media spotlight, suddenly hung in the balance. Audra, with the icy calm of someone masking her fury, announced that the launch would be postponed. It wasn't just logistics, it was a statement. "We'll move forward when the funding is secure," she said flatly, the weight of her disapproval hanging in the air. Sally, refusing to bow, retorted that Billy was already working on Jack, that money would come once Jack was persuaded to believe again. Audra's eyes widened in shock. To her, this was déjà vu, a nightmare replayed. They had sworn never to be in this position again, dependent on men who made unilateral decisions about their future, reduced to pawns in a larger game. Yet here they were, once again cornered between Jack and Billy, between the very forces they had once vowed to outmaneuver. Over at Jabot, Jack Abbott was already dealing with the storm's first waves. His phone lit up with a call from Jill, her voice sharp and demanding, full of the briskness of a woman who had seen too many fires and knew exactly when one was spreading. The video feed flickered, Jill's expression taut with equal parts curiosity and dread. She wasted no time in cutting to the chase. Who was in trouble, and how deep was it? Jack, weary but resolute, reminded her that Billy's name was tied to the unfolding mess. Jill, bristling, pressed harder, suspecting Kane's involvement, because history had taught her that where Billy floundered, Kane Ashby often lurked nearby, stirring complications. Jack's voice hardened, the old wounds surfacing as he reminded Jill how deeply she had hurt Billy, how her decisions in the past had left scars that never fully healed. "He believes you forgave Kane and punished him for everything," Jack said, his voice thick with both empathy and exasperation. Jill faltered, her sharpness dimmed for a moment as the truth sank in. Billy's resentment was not a fleeting mood, it was a wound that never closed, festering in silence until it threatened to consume him again. Jack, though protective of his brother, was also frustrated. Billy's endless cycles of rebellion and contrition had worn down everyone around him, and now here he was again, at the center of Sally's gamble, Audra's fury, and Jill's guilt. The overlapping tensions between Newman, Abbott, and every outlier in their orbit painted a picture of a city on the verge of chaos. Victor Newman preparing for war meant rivalries would deepen. Sally Spectra taking another chance on Billy Abbott meant old wounds would reopen and new enemies would surface. Audra Charles, sharp and unyielding, would not stand quietly while her vision was jeopardized by men's whims. And Jill Abbott, caught between guilt and pragmatism, would have to face the reality that her son's path was spiraling back into familiar, destructive patterns. It was soap opera in its purest form. Families fracturing, alliances shifting, and decisions made in moments of weakness echoing far into the future. For the Newmans, Abbotts, and every player entangled in their wars, the battles ahead promised not just bruised egos or corporate losses, but betrayals that could carve permanent divides. As Victor tightened his grip, Sally tested her faith, Audra sharpened her claws, and Jill weighed her regrets. One truth became clear: Genoa City was bracing itself for another reckoning, and no family, no empire, would emerge untouched. The air in Genoa City was thick with unease, and though business meetings and family dinners carried on as usual, everyone could feel the undercurrent of something larger rising beneath the surface. At Jabot, Jack Abbott's patience had stretched to its breaking point, a tightrope frayed by years of forgiving his brother only to be betrayed again. When Jill appeared on his screen, her tone sharp yet weary, Jack had no illusions. This was not a casual check-in but another attempt to gauge just how deep the trouble went. She demanded to know why Kane was being painted as a threat yet again, why the Abbott and Newman camp spoke of him as though he were the architect of every scheme haunting Genoa City. Jack, his eyes heavy with exasperation, cut her off with a blunt retort that if she wanted to understand, she needed to stop asking questions from a distance and get on a plane to see the reality for herself. Jill's face tightened, the defensive spark in her gaze dimmed by the weight of Jack's frustration, and for a brief second she seemed uncertain, torn between defending Kane and protecting Billy from himself. But before she could form a response, a knock came at Jack's office door, and he glanced up to see the very man at the center of their conversation standing there with a pleading expression. Billy hesitated for a moment, as though gathering the courage to step across the threshold, then spoke with a raw edge of desperation. He needed to talk, he said, not about business or ambition, but about family, about finding someone to listen before he unraveled completely. Jack's jaw tightened, his instincts telling him that this was yet another cycle about to repeat, but he nonetheless ended the call with Jill, muttering that they would continue later. Billy entered, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own guilt, and confessed that he and Sally had reconciled, that they were building a path forward together, and that he wanted Jack's support to make Abbott Communications thrive again. His words came fast, spilling out like someone clinging to hope, and then the request followed, the one Jack had been dreading. Billy wanted Jack to reinvest, to once again stand as the sole financier of a project that had already consumed far too much energy, trust, and faith. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Jack leaned back, his expression carved with disappointment, and finally told Billy the truth he had been holding in for too long. He wasn't sure he could do it anymore. Every time he tried to stand by Billy, to believe that this time things would be different, Billy managed to push him farther away. This wasn't about money, it was about trust, about the endless revolving door of promises and betrayals. Jack's voice cracked with a mixture of sadness and steel as he admitted he could not continue playing this game of back and forth, not when his brother never seemed to learn from the wreckage he left behind. Billy, defensive yet vulnerable, swore that he was done with Kane, that Chancellor held no appeal for him anymore, that the battles of the past were behind him. But Jack, tired of empty words, shook his head. He had heard it all before, and the repetition had drained any faith he once held. Billy's insistence meant little now. Words were worthless unless proven by actions, and Jack no longer had the energy to wait for those actions to come. While the Abbott family strained under their internal fractures, across town Victor Newman was already shifting gears into full command mode. Summoning Victoria, Nick, and Nikki into the familiar confines of the Newman ranch, he laid out the battlefield with the precision of a general. His voice was low but firm as he explained that Kane had once again positioned himself at the center of dangerous currents, manipulating circumstances in ways that could destabilize both the Newman and Abbott empires if left unchecked. He admitted, to the surprise of his children, that Jack had quietly suggested the possibility of cooperation, an idea Victor rarely entertained without skepticism. Nikki, always attuned to the nuances of her husband's strategy, reminded Victoria and Nick that if their father was even entertaining Jack's proposal, it meant the stakes were far higher than they realized. Victor did not align with rivals out of convenience, he only did so when the threat at hand could endanger the very foundation of their family's power. Victoria sat upright, her eyes sharp with both interest and doubt, weighing the implications of such an alliance. She had long distrusted Kane, but the thought of merging efforts with Jack Abbott struck her as both pragmatic and perilous. Nick, arms crossed, voiced his skepticism outright, questioning whether they could ever truly trust the Abbotts in a fight that touched so close to the heart of Chancellor and Newman business. But Victor silenced them with a single look, the kind that carried decades of authority. He reminded them that this was not about personal grudges or pride, it was about survival, about ensuring that Kane could not worm his way deeper into their world. Nikki added her quiet support, telling their children that if Victor was willing to bend, they should be willing to follow. In that room, the weight of generations bore down on them. The Newmans had faced enemies before, but Kane represented a different kind of danger, one that blurred the line between family vendettas and corporate sabotage, between past betrayals and present manipulations. Victor's gathering was not just a strategy session but a warning. The war was shifting, and every Newman would be expected to fight. The alliance with Jack, once unthinkable, now seemed like the only path to securing their empire's future. Back at Jabot, Billy's voice faltered as he realized Jack's resolve would not waver this time. He had played the repentant son, the prodigal brother too many times, and Jack was no longer willing to shoulder the consequences. As Jack turned back to his desk, the distance between them grew like a canyon, wide and unbridgeable. Billy left with his head bowed, muttering promises into the air, but Jack's silence spoke louder than any words. For all of Billy's desperate attempts to prove he had changed, his brother's faith had finally run dry. The stage was set for an explosive convergence. The Abbotts were fracturing under the weight of old betrayals, the Newmans were circling their wagons against a common enemy, and Kane's shadow loomed larger with each passing hour. Jill, caught in the middle, would soon be forced to confront the truth about where her loyalties lay. Sally, ever defiant, clung to her vision of a revived Abbott Communications even as Audra recoiled at the dangers of repeating history. And above it all, Victor Newman's steady hand guided the pieces into place, ready to strike at the moment Kane revealed his hand. What came next would test the limits of family, loyalty, and ambition. For Jack, it meant standing firm against the brother he loved but no longer trusted. For Jill, it meant choosing between the man she once protected and the son who still resented her. For Victor, it meant forging an alliance with an old rival to confront a threat neither could handle alone. And for Billy, it meant facing the harshest truth of all, that redemption could not be spoken into existence, it had to be earned, and his chances to prove himself were running out. In the Newman ranch, the atmosphere was as heavy as the storm clouds that often gathered before some great reckoning. Victor sat at the head of the table, his eyes sharp and commanding, as Nikki, Nick, and Victoria took their places. The subject was one that had resurfaced countless times, but the urgency in Victor's tone left no doubt that this conversation was different. Jack and I both suspect Jill has far more influence over Kane Ashby than Lily ever did, he said, his voice low but edged with authority. Nick leaned forward, his skepticism plain, asking what exactly they expected to gain by dragging Jill into this mess. Nikki, always the bridge between her husband's forcefulness and her children's doubts, answered with quiet conviction. Jill had history with Kane, she reminded them, history that stretched beyond business into personal entanglements that could still sway him. She can reach him, Nikki insisted, in a way none of us can. Victor nodded slowly, his gravelly voice adding the final weight to her claim. Jill could convince Kane not to align himself with darker forces, and that possibility alone was worth pursuing. Nick frowned, unconvinced, while Victoria exchanged a look with him that spoke volumes. They had been through too many cycles of betrayal to believe in Kane's redemption, and Jill's involvement only complicated matters further. Rising from their seats, both made it clear they were finished debating for now, unwilling to indulge their father's faith in yet another potential alliance. The door closed behind them, leaving Victor and Nikki in the quiet tension of the ranch's grand living room. It was in that silence that Jack Abbott appeared, his expression unreadable but his presence charged with the kind of significance that came only when enemies were forced into conversation. Standing firm, he met Victor's gaze and asked the question that had been circling between them for days: was Victor truly ready to join forces with him? It was a question that carried decades of rivalry, distrust, and grudging respect, and its very asking signaled that the old boundaries between Newman and Abbott might soon be rewritten. Across town, in the Abbott estate, another story was unfolding with far more personal stakes. Claire arrived unexpectedly, her demeanor calm yet shadowed, and was greeted at the door by Kyle and young Harrison Locke, who had only just returned from their trip to Italy. The boy's face lit up at the sight of her, his innocence cutting through the tension that always seemed to cling to Claire's presence. He asked shyly if they might walk him to school together, a request that warmed even Claire's guarded heart. She agreed softly, calling it a good idea, and Harrison beamed before pulling them both into an awkward but heartfelt hug. The gesture, innocent and uncalculated, bound them for a moment in a semblance of family unity, a glimpse of what could have been had the world around them not been fractured by secrets and betrayals. Later, after Harrison had been sent off with his school bag, Claire and Kyle returned to the dining room, where breakfast waited. The clink of silverware against china filled the silence until Kyle finally broke it, his words spilling with urgency and longing. He wanted her back, wanted the chance to rebuild what they had so recklessly let slip away. He admitted, without hesitation, that he would do anything to win her again, all she had to do was ask. His eyes searched hers, desperate for a flicker of the affection that had once burned between them, for some sign that the bond they shared had not been completely severed. But Claire's response was not what he hoped for. She looked at him steadily, her voice calm but laced with a steel that startled him. "This isn't about you," she told him. "This isn't about us as a couple." The words cut through the air like a blade, stripping away his illusions. She admitted she had rushed into their relationship too quickly, letting others whisper in her ear, letting circumstances push her into decisions that weren't truly hers. She confessed that she had ignored her instincts, that she had been swept into something before she even understood what she wanted. Kyle's heart sank as she spoke, realizing that this wasn't the conversation of someone looking to reconcile, it was the voice of someone preparing to step away. Claire leaned forward slightly, her expression softening but her words no less resolute. "I need to make my own mistakes," she said. "I need to make my own decisions. I can't keep relying on other people's permission to live my life." It was a declaration of independence, an assertion that whatever path she chose, even if it was the wrong one, would belong to her alone. She searched his face then, asking if that made sense, if he could understand the need to define herself outside of the roles others had assigned her. Kyle, his throat tight, forced himself to nod. "Yeah," he said quietly, the single syllable carrying more heartbreak than anger. And then, after a pause that stretched heavy between them, he added with raw honesty, "It sounds like you're breaking up with me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kyle's hope, fragile as glass, shattered in the face of Claire's resolve. He wanted to argue, to plead, to remind her of the moments they had shared, of the way Harrison had looked at them just minutes before, but he knew it would be useless. Claire's mind was made up, her heart set on charting her own course, no matter how painful it was for him to accept. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had placed a wall between them that no declaration of love could tear down. Back at the ranch, Victor and Jack's conversation carried on into the early hours, two titans of industry weighing the risks of unity against the certainty of destruction if they remained divided. At the Abbott estate, Kyle sat in the dining room long after Claire had left, staring at the untouched breakfast that had gone cold.